Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily just for you. The moving truck rattled as it pulled up to the edge of their new home. Maggie stepped out of the car, stretching her arms and taking in the view of their new neighborhood. Silent Pines was the kind of town that looked like it had been plucked straight from an old postcard. Neatly trimmed lawns, picket fences, and rows of quaint houses lined the street. A canopy of pine trees surrounded the area, their shadows stretching long and thin in the afternoon sun. It was picturesque, almost dreamlike, just what Maggie and Daniel had been searching for. "It's perfect, isn't it?" Daniel said, unloading boxes from the back of the truck. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Maggie smiled, nodding in agreement. After years of living in a cramped city apartment, this house, a cozy two-story with pale blue siding, felt like a sanctuary. They'd gotten it at an unbelievably good price, though neither of them thought to question why. As they began unpacking, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, but the street was quiet. Too quiet. No kids playing, no dogs barking, not even the hum of passing cars. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her. "Hey!" Daniel called, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Check this out." He pointed to a small ceramic gnome sitting in the flower bed by the front porch. It was chipped, its painted smile fading, but there was something unsettling about its wide, glassy eyes. "Charming," Maggie muttered, giving it a wide berth as she carried a box inside. The interior of the house was just as charming as the outside. Hardwood floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were painted in soft pastels. There was a fireplace in the living room, and the kitchen had an old-fashioned charm with its vintage appliances. Everything was in perfect condition. Almost too perfect. As the sun began to set, Maggie took a break from unpacking and stepped outside to get some air. That's when she saw her. Across the street, standing perfectly still on the edge of a lawn, was an old woman. She was dressed in a faded gray dress, her wiry white hair pulled back in a bun. Her eyes were fixed on Maggie's house, her face pale and expressionless. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "Hi there," she called, waving awkwardly. The woman didn't respond. Instead, her lips moved silently, forming words Maggie couldn't hear. "Everything okay?" Daniel's voice startled her. She turned to find him standing behind her, a concerned look on his face. "Yeah, it's just..." She gestured across the street, but when she looked back, the old woman was gone. Maggie's stomach tightened. She hadn't looked away for more than a second. "There was someone there," she insisted, "an old woman. She was just standing there, staring at the house." Daniel squinted at the empty street and shrugged. Probably just a nosy neighbor. Small towns are full of them. Maggie forced a laugh, but the unease lingered. As they finished unpacking, she couldn't shake the image of the woman's pale face and her silent, moving lips. That night, as Maggie lay in bed, she found herself straining to hear something, anything. But the silence was absolute. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, not even the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was as if the entire world outside their walls had gone still. Just as she was beginning to drift off, she thought she saw movement outside the window. Her heart skipped as she sat up, peering through the curtains. For a moment, she thought she saw the faint outline of the old woman, standing on the edge of their lawn, staring up at their window. But when she blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. The next morning, Maggie tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right about Silent Pines. The first night in Silent Pines should have been peaceful. Maggie and Daniel had spent the day unpacking, arranging furniture, and toasting their new beginning with cheap wine. By the time they went to bed, exhaustion had settled over them like a heavy blanket. Yet as Maggie lay in the unfamiliar room, staring at the ceiling, she found herself wide awake. Something was off. It was the silence. It was all-consuming, unnatural. In the city there had always been noise sirens, distant chatter, the hum of streetlights. Even in the quietest moments there had been a background hum, a comforting reminder that the world was alive. Here, it was different. Silent Pines wasn't just quiet, it was soundless. Maggie turned to Daniel, who was already snoring softly beside her. She envied how easily he adapted to their new environment. Pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, she closed her eyes, willing herself to relax. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was subtle at first, barely audible, like the brushing of tree branches against the house. Maggie's eyes snapped open, her pulse quickening. Scratch, scratch, scratch. She sat up in bed, straining to pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from the direction of the bedroom window. Her first thought was a tree branch swaying in the wind, but when she glanced outside, the pine trees surrounding their property stood perfectly still. Not a single leaf rustled, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Daniel," she whispered, nudging him. He grunted and turned over, mumbling something incoherent. "Daniel, wake up!" she hissed, louder this time. He groaned and rubbed his eyes, sitting up with a frown. "What is it? Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel listened for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't hear anything." Maggie frowned. The scratching had stopped. "I swear there was a sound. It was coming from the window." "It's probably a branch or some animal," Daniel said, already lying back down. "We're in the woods now, Mags. You'll have to get used to it." She wanted to believe him, but the tight knot in her stomach told her otherwise. She hesitated, then slid out of bed, walking over to the window. She hesitated again before pulling back the curtain. There was nothing there. Just the faint glow of the moonlight casting long shadows across the yard. Maggie let out a shaky breath and closed the curtain, forcing herself to laugh at her own paranoia. "See, nothing," Daniel mumbled sleepily. "Come back to bed." She did, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind made her flinch. Eventually, exhaustion won, and she drifted into a restless slumber. The next morning, the events of the night seemed almost trivial. In the daylight, the house felt warm and inviting, the eerie silence of the night replaced by the soft chirping of birds. Maggie almost laughed at herself for being so jumpy. As she sipped her coffee by the kitchen window, she noticed something unusual. The bedroom window on the outside had a smudge on the glass. She stepped out onto the lawn for a closer look. What she saw made her coffee cup slip from her hand, shattering on the ground. There on the glass was a single handprint. It was small, smaller than a child's, and smeared with dark streaks that looked almost like ash. The print was perfectly positioned as though whoever or whatever had made it was standing just outside their bedroom, watching them. Maggie stumbled back, her breath coming in quick gasps. She turned to look at the yard, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The woods stared back at her, still and quiet as ever. "Daniel!" she called, her voice shaking. He came rushing out, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong?" She pointed at the window, her hand trembling. That wasn't there last night." Daniel squinted at the smudge, then frowned. "Are you sure it wasn't just a leftover mark from the last owners?" "No," Maggie said firmly. "I cleaned those windows yesterday." He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it's a prank? Some kid from the neighborhood?" "Did you see any kids yesterday?" Maggie shot back. "This whole place is like a ghost town." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the forest. "All right, we'll keep an eye out. If it happens again, we'll figure out what to do." His attempt to reassure her didn't help much. Maggie spent the rest of the day on edge, glancing over her shoulder every time she stepped outside. That night, as they prepared for bed, Maggie double-checked every lock in the house. She closed the curtains tightly, making sure there were no gaps. When she finally crawled into bed, she tried to tell herself it was all in her head. But deep down, she knew she wasn't imagining things. Something or someone was watching them. And whatever it was, it thrived in the silence. The third day in Silent Pines was overcast, the gray sky casting an oppressive shadow over the town. Maggie couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest since finding the handprint. The eerie silence that blanketed the area seemed thicker today, like it was waiting to swallow her whole. She decided to go into town, hoping to distract herself and maybe learn more about the place. The market was a modest strip of old-fashioned shops, grocers, a bakery, a hardware store. The streets were nearly deserted, the few people milling about keeping their heads down and moving with purpose. Maggie walked into a small general store that smelled of wood polish and stale air. A bell jingled as she entered, and an older man behind the counter greeted her with a stiff nod. "Morning," Maggie said, trying to sound cheerful. She picked up a basket and began browsing the shelves, noting the oddly dated packaging on some items. The prices, written in chalk on small signs, seemed unusually low. As she picked up a can of soup, she overheard two women near the back of the store whispering. "Another one gone," one said, her voice barely audible. "Just like the others," the second woman replied. "The woods take them, always the same." They fell silent when they noticed Maggie glancing in their direction. The two exchanged a quick, nervous look and shuffled away toward the door. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. She approached the counter, where the old man was watching her with an unreadable expression. "Those women," Maggie began, hesitating. "Do you know what they were talking about?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting toward the clock on the wall. "Best to mind your own business, miss," he said gruffly. "You and your husband ought to keep to yourselves while you're here." Maggie frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The man's jaw tightened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not safe to go poking around. Some things are better left alone." Before she could press him further, the bell above the door jingled, and another customer walked in. The old man straightened, his expression hardening into one of polite indifference. Maggie left the store, clutching her bag of groceries, her mind racing with questions. When she returned home, Maggie told Daniel about the strange exchange. "It's like everyone in this town is hiding something," she said, pacing the kitchen. "And the way they talk about the woods, it's like they're scared of them." Daniel shrugged, peeling the label off a beer bottle. Small towns have their quirks, probably just some old superstition. "You didn't hear them," Maggie said, exasperated. "This isn't normal, Daniel. There's something wrong with this place." He set the bottle down and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Mags, you're overthinking it. Let's just relax, okay? We've got a whole new life ahead of us. Don't let a couple of gossipy neighbors ruin it." Maggie nodded reluctantly, though her unease didn't fade. She spent the rest of the evening trying to distract herself with unpacking and reading, but the feeling of being watched persisted. That night, the whispers began. Maggie was jolted awake by a faint sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as she lay still, straining to hear, she realized it was something else, low, murmuring voices. They were coming from downstairs. Her heart pounded as she nudged Daniel. "Wake up," she whispered. "There's someone in the house." Daniel groaned, half asleep. "You're imagining things." "No, I'm not," she insisted. "Listen." He sighed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Together they sat in silence, the whispers faint but unmistakable. Daniel's expression shifted, concern replacing his earlier dismissal. "Stay here," he said, climbing out of bed and grabbing the heavy flashlight from the nightstand. Maggie wanted to argue, but the fear in her throat made it impossible to speak. She listened intently as Daniel descended the stairs, the creak of each step echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, though she still couldn't make out the words. They seemed to surround the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly the murmurs stopped. The silence was deafening, and Maggie held her breath, waiting for Daniel to call out. But instead, she heard something else, a soft creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. "Daniel," she called, her voice trembling. No response. Maggie's pulse raced as she climbed out of bed, clutching her phone as a makeshift weapon. She crept down the stairs, her bare feet silent against the wood. The living room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon through the window. "Daniel," she whispered again. She found him standing in the middle of the room, the flashlight dangling limply in his hand. His eyes were fixed on the front door, which was now wide open. The cold night air seeped into the house, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. "What happened?" Maggie asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Daniel said, his tone hollow. "I locked it before bed, I swear." Together, they checked every corner of the house, but there was no sign of an intruder. When they finally returned to the bedroom, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching them. As she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the whispers began again, soft, faint, and coming from somewhere just beyond the walls. The morning after the whispers, Maggie was restless. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. The tension, the silence, the strange occurrences, they were suffocating her. She decided to visit Mrs. Carver, their closest neighbor, who had been so friendly when they first moved in. Maybe the elderly woman could shed some light on the bizarre events in Silent Pines. As Maggie approached the Carver's house, she noticed something odd. The curtains, usually drawn back to let in the sunlight, were tightly closed. The flower beds, which Mrs. Carver tended daily, were unkempt, weeds starting to creep in. Maggie hesitated at the front door, her knuckles hovering over the wood. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained eerily still. Maggie glanced around, hoping to spot someone nearby, but the street was empty as usual. After a moment's hesitation, she tried the door. To her surprise, it creaked open. "Mrs. Carver?" Maggie called, stepping inside. The interior of the house was dim, shadows clinging to every corner. A faint, musty smell hung in the air, as though the house had been abandoned for weeks. Maggie's unease grew as she ventured further in. The living room was in disarray, the coffee table overturned, and a lamp lay shattered on the floor. "Mrs. Carver?" she called again, her voice trembling. Her eyes were drawn to the far wall. There, scrawled in what looked like ash or soot, were the words, "Don't trust the silence." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The words were smeared as though written in a hurry, the strokes jagged and uneven. She reached out to touch the writing, but stopped short when she noticed something else. A faint trail of blackened footprints leading from the living room to the hallway. Swallowing her fear, Maggie followed the trail, her footsteps hesitant. The hallway was narrow, lined with family photos that felt like they were watching her. At the end of the hall was a door slightly ajar. The footprints led straight to it. Pushing the door open, Maggie found herself in a small, cluttered office. Papers were scattered across the desk, and an old rotary phone sat beside a stack of yellowed notebooks. One notebook lay open, and Maggie leaned over to read it. The writing was frantic, the words barely legible. "It's in the walls. The silence hides it. It listens. It waits. It takes." Maggie's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. The notes became more erratic, filled with warnings and fragmented sentences. "They come at night. Don't answer the door. Don't look at them. Don't listen." Suddenly, there was a noise, a faint creak from the hallway. Maggie froze, her breath hitching. She turned, half expecting to see Mrs. Carver, but the hall was empty. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing eerily in the silence. The creak came again, this time from upstairs. Against her better judgment, Maggie ascended the staircase, her hand gripping the banister tightly. The second floor was just as dim as the rest of the house, the air thick and stale. A faint clicking sound drew her toward one of the bedrooms. Pushing the door open, she found the room empty, except for a rocking chair in the corner. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Maggie's eyes darted around the room, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. She could feel it. As she backed out of the room, she noticed something strange about the chair. The seat cushion was covered in a thin layer of ash. Panicked, Maggie ran downstairs and out of the house, gasping for air as she stumbled onto the front lawn. She looked back at the house, half expecting to see someone or something staring at her from the windows. But the house remained still, its darkened windows like empty eyes. She hurried home, her mind racing. When she burst through the front door, Daniel was in the kitchen, looking startled. "What's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her. "Mrs. Carver," Maggie stammered. "She's gone. Her house, there's something wrong with it. There's writing on the walls, footprints. I don't know where she is." Daniel frowned, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Slow down. What do you mean, she's gone? Did you call the police?" "No," Maggie admitted. I didn't know what to do. You have to see it. Her house is—" "Maggie," Daniel interrupted gently. "I saw her this morning." Maggie blinked. "What?" "I was taking out the trash, and she was standing in her yard," Daniel said. "I waved to her. She waved back." Maggie shook her head. "That's not possible. I was just there. The house is Daniel. It's not right." Daniel sighed, clearly trying to calm her down. "Look, maybe you're just stressed. Let's go over there together, okay? We'll check it out." Reluctantly, Maggie agreed. Together, they walked to Mrs. Carver's house. But when they arrived, the door was closed and the curtains were neatly drawn. The flower beds were freshly tended, and there was no sign of disarray inside. It looked perfectly normal. "You see?" Daniel said, gesturing toward the house. "There's nothing wrong." Maggie stood frozen on the lawn, staring at the front door. It was as though the house had reset itself, erasing all evidence of what she had seen. But as they turned to leave, Maggie caught a glimpse of the upstairs window. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure, a pale, shadowy shape, watching them from the darkness. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her stomach churned with dread. Something was happening in Silent Pines, something she couldn't explain. And whatever it was, she knew Mrs. Carver wasn't coming back. The unease gnawed at Maggie like a splinter lodged in her mind. Daniel's reassurances hadn't helped. If anything, they only made her feel more alone. She couldn't forget what she'd seen in Mrs. Carver's house, the scrawled warnings and the eerie footprints. And now the house looked completely normal, as if none of it had happened. But Maggie knew what she had seen, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the dense pine trees, casting long shadows over the town, Maggie sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She searched for anything, news articles, forums, even urban legends, that might explain the strange occurrences in Silent Pines. But there was nothing. No history of disappearances, no ghost stories, nothing that hinted at the darkness she felt closing in around her. "Dinner's ready," Daniel called from the kitchen. He had taken it upon himself to cook tonight, hoping it might lift Maggie's spirits. She set her phone down and joined him at the table, forcing a smile. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, but Maggie's appetite had vanished. She poked at her food, her thoughts elsewhere. "Still thinking about Mrs. Carver?" Daniel asked gently. Maggie nodded. "It doesn't make sense, Daniel. I saw her house. What I saw wasn't normal, and now it's like nothing ever happened." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what to tell you, Mags. Maybe it was a bad dream, or maybe you're just stressed. Moving is a big adjustment." "It wasn't a dream," she snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "And I'm not imagining things." Daniel raised his hands in surrender. Okay, I believe you, but we can't do anything about it tonight. Let's just try to relax." Maggie bit her lip, nodding reluctantly. As much as she hated to admit it, he was right. She couldn't do anything about Mrs. Carver, or the strange whispers, or the handprint, or the silence of the town, until she had more answers. That night, the oppressive quiet settled over the house again. Daniel fell asleep almost instantly, but Maggie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past few days replayed in her mind, a loop of unanswered questions and creeping dread. And then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moved across the room. Maggie's breath hitched, her body stiffening. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, She thought it was just a trick of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. But then the shadow shifted again, unmistakably human in shape. It lingered in the corner of the room, motionless, but unmistakably there. "Daniel," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. She reached over to shake him, but he didn't stir. "Daniel, wake up!" The figure stepped closer. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its body more like a silhouette than something solid. Its face, or where its face should have been, was an empty void, darker than the surrounding shadows. Maggie's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The figure stood at the foot of the bed now, unmoving, as if it were studying her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly it leaned forward, its featureless head tilting as though it were listening. And then it was gone. The room was empty again, as if nothing had happened. Maggie sat frozen, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She shook Daniel harder this time, and he finally woke up, groggy and irritated. "What is it, Maggie?" he muttered. "There was someone here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the room. I saw it." Daniel sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "A shadow," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "It was standing at the foot of the bed. It didn't have a face. Daniel, it was here!" Daniel frowned, his expression a mix of concern and doubt. "There's no one here, Mags. You must have been dreaming." "I wasn't dreaming," she snapped, her voice cracking. "It was real. I saw it." Daniel sighed and got out of bed, checking the locks on the doors and windows, just as he had the other night. "Everything's secure," he said. "There's no sign of anyone. You're safe." But Maggie didn't feel safe. She felt watched. The next day she avoided leaving the house. The sunlight didn't comfort her anymore. It felt cold, hollow, as if the light itself was artificial. As she moved through the house, she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow again. That evening, as Daniel watched TV in the living room, Maggie stood by the window, staring out at the street. She had the uneasy feeling that someone was watching the house. Her eyes scanned the shadows cast by the pine trees, and then she saw it. The figure. It stood at the edge of the tree line, its form blending with the darkness. It was watching her. She was sure of it. "Daniel!" she called, her voice sharp. He came running, startled. "What's wrong?" "There," she said, pointing toward the trees. "Do you see it?" Daniel squinted, following her gaze. "See what?" "The figure," she said, her voice trembling. "It's right there by the trees." Daniel looked again, but his expression softened. "Maggie, there's nothing there." She turned back to the window, and her stomach dropped. The figure was gone. That night, as Maggie lay in bed, the whispers returned. Faint and distant at first, then growing louder, closer. This time, the words were clearer, though they still didn't make sense. They seemed to echo inside her head, pulling at the edges of her sanity. And over the whispers, she thought she heard something else. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside their bedroom door. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. Maggie clutched the blanket, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers, faint but persistent, seemed to emanate from all around her, seeping through the walls like smoke. She turned to Daniel, who was somehow still asleep, his breathing steady and oblivious to the growing dread in the room. "Daniel," she hissed, shaking him hard. "Wake up!" His eyes fluttered open, bleary with sleep. "Maggie, what?" "Listen!" she interrupted, her voice trembling. For a moment the room was silent. Then, as if on cue, the whispers returned, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Daniel sat up, his eyes narrowing as he strained to hear. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the door. Maggie's breath hitched as the door handle rattled, the metallic sound piercing the oppressive silence. She clung to Daniel, her nails digging into his arm. "Stay here," he whispered, sliding out of bed. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, the beam cutting through the dark as he approached the door. "Daniel, don't!" Maggie begged, but he ignored her, his jaw set with determination. He yanked the door open, shining the flashlight into the hallway. Nothing. The corridor was empty. bathed in eerie stillness. The whispers ceased abruptly, as if silenced by Daniel's presence. He turned back to Maggie, shaking his head. "There's no one here." Before she could respond, the sound of laughter, soft, chilling, and distinctly childlike, echoed down the hall. It was distant, yet close enough to send a shiver down Maggie's spine. Daniel stepped into the hallway, the flashlight beam darting left and right. "Daniel, please come back," Maggie pleaded, but he was already moving toward the source of the sound. Maggie couldn't bring herself to stay alone in the bedroom. She followed Daniel, clutching a heavy candle holder as a makeshift weapon. The laughter grew louder as they approached the stairs, a haunting melody of giggles that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. At the foot of the stairs, Daniel paused, his flashlight flickering. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. "Yes," Maggie whispered, gripping his arm. "It's coming from the living room." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Together, they descended the stairs, their footsteps creaking on the old wood. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. And then they saw it. The black figure stood by the fireplace, its form tall and unnaturally thin, its face a blank void. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an unbearable weight. Maggie felt her knees buckle, and she gripped Daniel's arm tightly to steady herself. "What the hell is that?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them. Then, without warning, it disappeared, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and restless vigilance. By morning, Maggie was determined to get answers. She couldn't endure another night in the house without knowing what was happening. After a hurried breakfast, she decided to visit the only person in town who might be willing to talk, the young boy she had seen at the market. The market was as quiet and subdued as ever, the few locals present avoiding eye contact with Maggie. She spotted the boy near a fruit stand, his dirty sneakers scuffing the pavement as he inspected an apple. Summoning her courage, Maggie approached him. "Hi," she said softly, crouching to his level. "Do you remember me?" The boy glanced up, his expression wary. He nodded. "I need your help," Maggie said. "Something strange is happening. I think you know what I'm talking about." The boy's eyes darted nervously to the shopkeeper, who was watching them from behind the counter. He grabbed Maggie's wrist and tugged her toward a quieter corner of the market. "You shouldn't have moved here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The town, it's cursed." Maggie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, cursed?" He hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "A long time ago, the town made a deal with the woods. Something bad happened, and the deal was broken. Now, the woods take what they want." "What do you mean, the woods take what they want?" Maggie pressed. "The silence," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not normal. It's how they hide. The black figures, the whispers, they're from the woods. They come for people, new people." Maggie's blood ran cold. "What happens to them?" "They're taken," the boy said simply, "and they don't come back." Maggie stumbled back to the house, her mind reeling. She found Daniel in the kitchen, his face pale and drawn. "You won't believe this," she began, but he cut her off. "There was someone at the door while you were gone," he said, his voice shaking. "An old woman. She said she needed to warn us." Maggie froze. What did she say? "She didn't get the chance," Daniel said. "She just disappeared, like she was never there." The weight of the boy's words settled heavily on Maggie. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the dark line of trees at the edge of their yard. The woods were watching, and they weren't done with them yet. The warning from the boy at the market and the appearance of the old woman left Maggie's nerves frayed. She spent the rest of the day pacing the house, unable to shake the feeling that something catastrophic was about to happen. Daniel tried to reassure her, but his own unease was becoming more obvious. As evening fell, a thick fog rolled in, wrapping the house in a suffocating blanket of gray. The usual stillness of silent pines seemed heavier tonight, as though the entire town were holding its breath. After dinner, Maggie sat by the window, staring out at the fog-shrouded street. The black figure's presence lingered in her mind, its faceless head tilting in silent judgment. She replayed the boy's words over and over. The woods take what they want. Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mags, come sit with me," he said, patting the spot on the couch beside him. "You've been staring out that window all day." Reluctantly, she joined him, curling up beside him as he turned on the television. He flipped through the channels, but every station was static. Maggie frowned, her unease growing. "That's weird," Daniel muttered, tapping the remote. "We had a signal earlier." "It's the fog," Maggie said, though her voice wavered. "It's messing with the reception." Daniel didn't argue, but Maggie could see the tension in his jaw. He set the remote down and pulled her closer, but she didn't feel comforted. The oppressive silence was pressing down on her, heavier than ever. The knock came just after midnight. It was faint at first, a soft rapping at the front door that could almost be mistaken for the wind. Maggie sat bolt upright, her heart racing. Daniel stirred beside her, groaning as he rubbed his eyes. "What was that?" Maggie whispered. Daniel frowned. "Probably the wind," he said, though his tone was far from certain. Then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, louder this time. Daniel got up, grabbing the flashlight from the coffee table. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "No," Maggie said, standing. "I'm not letting you answer that alone." Together they approached the door. Daniel peered through the peephole, his body tensing. "What do you see?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling. "It's her," Daniel said, stepping back. "The old woman from this morning." Maggie's stomach dropped. "What is she doing here?" "She's just standing there," Daniel said. "She's not moving." Maggie hesitated. Every instinct told her not to open the door, but curiosity and fear warred within her. Finally, Daniel turned the lock and pulled the door open, just enough to see outside. The old woman stood on the porch, her frail form barely visible through the fog. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. Her lips moved, forming silent words. "Can you hear her?" Maggie asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, she's just mouthing something." Maggie stepped closer, squinting at the woman. She could just make out the words, "It's here. You have to leave." "What's here?" Maggie whispered, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised a bony hand, pointing past them into the house. Maggie and Daniel turned, their blood running cold. The black figure stood in the living room, its featureless form looming in the shadows. The door slammed shut behind them, the old woman gone. Daniel grabbed Maggie's hand, pulling her toward the stairs. "Run!" he shouted. They bolted up the staircase, their feet pounding against the wooden steps. The whispers began again, louder this time, echoing through the house like a chorus of disembodied voices. They reached the bedroom, slamming the door behind them. Daniel wedged a chair under the handle, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. Maggie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. The whispers grew louder, as though the walls themselves were alive. Then came the sound of scratching, slow and deliberate, moving along the door. Maggie backed away, clutching Daniel's arm as the handle rattled violently. "What do we do?" she whispered. Daniel looked around the room, his eyes wild. "The window," he said. "We can climb out." Maggie hesitated. The thought of stepping into the fog, into the woods, was almost worse than facing whatever was behind the door. But they had no choice. Daniel opened the window, helping Maggie climb onto the roof. The fog was so thick she could barely see the ground below. Her legs trembled as she inched along the edge, clinging to the gutter for balance. Behind her, Daniel froze, his eyes widening in horror. "Maggie, don't look back." But she did. The black figure stood in the bedroom, its faceless head tilted as it watched them. Slowly it raised an arm, pointing directly at her. Maggie screamed, losing her balance and slipping off the roof. She fell, the ground rushing up to meet her, but the fog seemed to catch her, cushioning her fall. She lay there, stunned, as Daniel climbed down after her. "We have to go," he said, pulling her to her feet, now. They ran, the whispers following them as they plunged into the woods. The trees loomed like skeletal hands, their branches clawing at the sky. Maggie's lungs burned, but she didn't dare stop. Finally, they reached the road, the faint outline of their car emerging from the fog. Daniel fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. They climbed in, slamming the doors shut. As Daniel started the engine, Maggie glanced back toward the house. The fog swirled around it, thick and suffocating, but she could just make out the black figure standing in the driveway, watching them leave. As they sped down the road, the whispers faded, replaced by the hum of the engine. But Maggie knew this wasn't over. The curse wasn't bound to the house, it was bound to them. And it was only a matter of time before it found them again. Maggie and Daniel didn't stop driving until Silent Pines was far behind them. The dense fog had thinned, giving way to a dark, starless night. The oppressive silence that had haunted the town seemed to lift as they entered open highways, but the tension in the car was suffocating. Maggie gripped the edge of her seat, her thoughts racing. The black figure, the whispers, the old woman's warning, all of it replayed in her mind, a swirling storm of terror and confusion. Beside her, Daniel's knuckles whitened as he clutched the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "We need to call someone," Maggie finally said, her voice breaking the heavy quiet. "The police, the news, someone who can—" "And tell them what?" Daniel interrupted, his voice taut. "That shadows are chasing us? That the woods are alive? They'll think we're insane, Maggie." Her stomach churned. He wasn't wrong, but the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen," she said. "People need to know." Daniel didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, his gaze unblinking. They reached a roadside motel just past midnight. The neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering between vacancy and no vacancy. Daniel parked the car, and they sat in silence for a moment before he spoke. "We'll stay here for the night," he said. "Figure out what to do in the morning." Maggie nodded, though the idea of sleeping seemed impossible. The thought of being in another quiet room, vulnerable to whatever was hunting them, made her skin crawl. The lobby was empty, save for a sleepy clerk behind the desk who handed them a key without asking many questions. Their room was small and dingy, the air stale and heavy with the scent of mildew. Maggie locked the door and slid the chain across, checking it twice before sitting on the edge of the bed. Daniel turned on the TV, the low hum of static filling the room as he flipped through the channels. Maggie sat silently, staring at the floor. For the first time since they fled the house, the enormity of their situation hit her. "We left everything," she said quietly. "All our things, our home, everything. We're alive," Daniel said flatly. "That's what matters." But was that true? Maggie wondered. If the curse was bound to them, as the boy had implied, then they hadn't escaped at all. They had only delayed the inevitable. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Maggie finally dozed off. She awoke to the sound of muffled voices, her heart immediately racing. She sat up, disoriented, and realized Daniel wasn't beside her. "Daniel?" she called softly. There was no response. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the television, still playing static. Maggie got up, her legs shaky, and checked the bathroom. Empty. She opened the door to the hallway, half expecting to find him pacing outside, but the corridor was silent. Her stomach clenched with dread. Where had he gone? Maggie searched the motel grounds, her fear mounting with every passing second. The parking lot was deserted, their car still in its spot. The office was dark, the clerk nowhere to be seen. She checked the vending machines, the stairwell, even the tiny pool at the back of the property. "Daniel!" she shouted into the night, her voice echoing eerily. And then she heard it. The whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, circling her, pulling at the edges of her sanity. Maggie turned, her breath hitching, and saw something that made her blood run cold. Footprints, ashy black footprints leading from the parking lot into the woods beyond the motel. They were large, mismatched, as if made by someone or something, with an uneven gait. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No. But she couldn't ignore the pull. If there was even a chance Daniel was out there, she had to find him. The woods were dense and shadowy, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy of trees. The whispers grew louder as Maggie followed the footprints, her heart pounding with every step. She clutched her phone tightly, using its weak flashlight to light her path. "Daniel!" she called, her voice trembling. The whispers responded, rising in volume, forming words she couldn't quite understand. They seemed to come from all directions, disorienting her. And then she saw it. Daniel stood in a clearing, his back to her. He was motionless, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Daniel!" she cried, running toward him. "What are you doing? We have to." He turned and Maggie froze. His face was blank, devoid of emotion, his eyes wide and unseeing. His lips moved, forming silent words, but no sound came out. He raised a hand, pointing to something behind her. Maggie turned slowly, her heart pounding. The black figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its form impossibly tall, its faceless head tilted as it regarded her. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as though it were draining the air from the forest. Maggie turned back to Daniel, reaching for him. "Come on, we have to go," she pleaded, but he didn't move. "Daniel, please!" The whispers grew deafening, drowning out her voice. The black figure began to move, gliding toward them with an unnatural, jerking motion. "Daniel!" Maggie screamed, grabbing his arm. He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was something there, an apology, a flicker of recognition, before he pulled away, stepping toward the figure. "No!" Maggie cried, reaching for him, but her fingers grasped only air. The fog thickened, swallowing Daniel and the black figure whole. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving Maggie alone in the silent, empty clearing. She stumbled back to the motel, her body trembling, her mind reeling. Daniel was gone. She didn't know where or how or if she'd ever see him again. All she knew was that the woods had taken him. And they weren't done with her yet. The motel room was empty when Maggie returned. The television still hummed with static, and Daniel's shoes were by the bed just as he had left them. It was as if he had never been there, as if his entire presence had been erased. She collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling. Tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't stop replaying what she had seen in the woods. Daniel's vacant stare, the black figure looming behind him, it was burned into her mind. He had pointed at something before he disappeared, hadn't he? Maggie tried to focus, but the memory felt fragmented, like a fading dream. The whispers still echoed faintly in her ears, their sinister cadence pulling at the edges of her sanity. Maggie spent the next few hours scouring the room for clues, anything that might lead her to Daniel. She checked his phone, his wallet, even the folded map they had used to navigate to Silent Pines. But there was nothing, no sign, no explanation. Then she noticed something she had missed before. On the desk by the window was a trail of black ash, thin and deliberate, leading to the drawer. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside was a piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, as though it had been there for decades. The writing was jagged and uneven, scrawled in thick, black ink. "The woods are a doorway. The silence is the key. Follow, but do not trust what you see." Maggie's hands shook as she read the message. A doorway? Was that where Daniel had gone? Was there a way to bring him back? Her gaze shifted to the window. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the edge of the woods in the distance. The memory of Daniel's final look haunted her, a flicker of recognition, a silent apology. He hadn't wanted to leave her. He had been taken, and she was going to get him back. The forest was darker than before, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy above. Maggie gripped her phone tightly, using its weak flashlight to illuminate the path. The ground was damp, and the smell of moss and decay filled the air. She followed the trail of ash footprints she had seen earlier, her breath shallow and her heart pounding. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made her jump. But she pressed on, driven by a singular determination to find Daniel. The whispers returned as she ventured deeper into the woods, faint at first but growing louder with each step. They swirled around her, indistinct and maddening. She tried to block them out, focusing on the path ahead. The footprints led her to a clearing, one she hadn't seen before. At its center was a massive tree, its twisted roots curling like claws around a dark, gaping hole in the ground. The air here was colder, the whispers louder, as if the forest itself was alive and breathing. Maggie approached the hole cautiously, peering into the darkness. It seemed to go on forever, a black void that swallowed the light from her phone. The whispers were deafening now, forming fragmented words. Follow, find, take. She hesitated, her body trembling. Was this the doorway the note had mentioned? Was Daniel down there? The thought of stepping into the abyss terrified her, but the alternative, leaving him behind, was unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, Maggie gripped a nearby root and began to climb down. The descent was disorienting. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and the walls of the hole seemed to close in around her. The whispers followed her, louder and more coherent now. They weren't random, they were speaking to her. You shouldn't have come, it's too late, turn back. Maggie ignored them, her determination outweighing her fear. Finally her feet touched solid ground. She turned, her phone's flashlight illuminating a narrow tunnel that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were covered in claw marks, and the ground was slick with something dark and sticky. She chose a direction and started walking, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The whispers continued, now mingling with faint, distant cries. One voice stood out above the rest, a familiar one. "Daniel," she called, her voice trembling. The cries grew louder, leading her deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. Maggie's heart pounded as she rounded a corner and came to a halt. The tunnel opened into a massive cavern, its walls shimmering with an unnatural dark light. At the center of the cavern stood a massive, gnarled tree, its roots spreading out like veins. Figures were trapped within the roots, dozens of them. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Maggie's breath caught as she spotted Daniel among them. He was partially engulfed by the tree, his body rigid and his eyes wide and vacant. His lips moved silently, echoing the whispers she had heard in the woods. "No!" she cried, running toward him. As she reached for him, the ground beneath her shifted. The black figure emerged from the shadows, its form towering over her. It tilted its head, watching her with an unnerving stillness. Maggie's body froze, her muscles refusing to obey her. The whispers surged, a cacophony of voices screaming inside her head. "Let him go!" She managed to choke out, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing to the tree. The roots writhed, tightening around Daniel's body as his lips continued to move silently. "Take me!" Maggie shouted. "If that's what you want, take me instead." The whispers ceased abruptly. The figure tilted its head again as if considering her offer. Then, without warning, it lunged forward. Pain exploded through Maggie's body as the figure's darkness enveloped her. She felt herself being pulled toward the tree, her vision blurring as the roots reached for her. Her last conscious thought was of Daniel, his face frozen in silent despair. And then everything went black. When she awoke, she was lying on the forest floor, the morning sun filtering through the trees. The clearing was gone, and so was the tree. Maggie sat up, her body aching, her mind spinning. "Daniel?" she called, her voice hoarse. There was no response. The forest was empty, silent. But in the distance, she thought she heard the faintest sound whispers, calling her name. Maggie sat on the forest floor, trembling, her body aching from the events of the night. The morning light filtered through the trees, its warmth doing nothing to ease the cold dread settled deep in her chest. The clearing, the tree, the cavern, all of it was gone, as though it had never existed. But Maggie knew it had been real. She could feel it in her bones, in the faint whispers still lingering in her ears. Her voice cracked as she called out, "Daniel?" The only reply was the rustle of leaves in the windless forest. Her hands clenched into fists. She couldn't leave without him. She wouldn't. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she staggered to her feet, scanning the woods for any sign of where he might be. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Maggie turned in a slow circle, her eyes darting between the shadows. "Where are you?" she shouted, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The whispers grew louder, forming words. "You chose this. You opened the door. You belong to us now." "No," Maggie screamed, clutching her head. "I didn't choose anything. I just want Daniel back." The forest fell silent. As Maggie stumbled through the woods, her legs weak and unsteady, she noticed something strange. The trees around her began to shift, their trunks twisting and bending as if alive. The path she thought she had taken vanished, replaced by a winding, unfamiliar trail. Panic clawed at her as she realized she was being led somewhere. The trail opened into a new clearing. At its center was a stone altar, ancient and covered in moss. Symbols carved into the stone glowed faintly, pulsating with a dark energy. And standing behind the altar, shrouded in shadow, was the black figure. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the clearing with an overwhelming sense of dread. Her eyes were drawn to the altar. Lying on its surface was something that made her knees buckle. Daniel. He was motionless, his face pale, his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell faintly, as though he were caught in some kind of unnatural sleep. Roots, thin and blackened like veins, wrapped around his arms and legs, anchoring him to the altar. "Daniel!" Maggie cried, rushing toward him. The black figure raised a hand, and an invisible force slammed into her, throwing her backward. She hit the ground hard, pain radiating through her body. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Take me instead. Just let him go." The whispers returned, swirling around her like a storm. "You broke the pact. The silence is ours. He is ours." "What pact?" Maggie screamed. "I don't know what you're talking about." The black figure tilted its head, and suddenly the whispers grew louder, taking on a strange rhythmic pattern. Images flooded Maggie's mind, visions of the past, of silent pines long before she and Daniel had arrived. She saw a family living in her house, their faces pale with fear. She saw them standing in the woods, speaking to something hidden in the shadows. She saw the black figure emerging from the darkness to strike a deal. The town would thrive, untouched by time, in exchange for silence. The silence would be sacred, a shield to keep the entity at bay. But the pact had been broken when outsiders Maggie and Daniel disrupted the fragile balance. The whispers faded, and Maggie was left gasping on the forest floor. She understood now. Silent Pines had been a prison for the entity, and she and Daniel had unknowingly freed it. The price for their mistake was steep. The black figure stepped closer, its faceless form towering over her. Maggie scrambled to her knees, her voice shaking as she pleaded, "There must be another way. I'll do anything. Please, just don't take him." For a moment the figure was still. Then it raised a hand and pointed to the altar. The roots holding Daniel began to writhe, tightening around his body. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment their gazes met. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice weak. "Daniel," she cried, reaching for him. "I'm here!" The roots pulsed, glowing with the same dark energy as the symbols on the altar. Daniel's body convulsed, his face contorted in pain. "Stop!" Maggie screamed, her voice breaking. "I'll do it. Whatever you want, I'll do it." The black figure froze, lowering its hand. The roots loosened their grip on Daniel, and his body slumped against the altar, motionless but still breathing. The whispers surged, swirling around Maggie like a tempest. Your life or his. The choice was clear, and Maggie didn't hesitate. "Take me," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Just let him go." The black figure extended its arm, and a tendril of shadow snaked toward her. It wrapped around her wrist, cold and suffocating, pulling her toward the altar. Maggie didn't resist. She kept her eyes on Daniel, her love for him burning brighter than her fear. As the darkness consumed her, the last thing she heard was the sound of Daniel's voice, faint but clear. "Maggie!" When Daniel woke, he was lying in the middle of the woods. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong. He sat up, disoriented, his mind foggy. "Maggie," he called, his voice hoarse. There was no reply. He searched the forest, calling her name over and over, but she was nowhere to be found. Eventually, he stumbled back to the road where their car was parked. The motel was gone, the fog lifted. Silent pines lay far behind him, but the memory of the black figure and the whispers haunted him. He never found Maggie, but sometimes late at night he swore he could hear her voice in the silence, calling his name.